Stephen, the owner of an airline, faced blatant racism on his own plane when a flight attendant, unaware of his identity, refused to serve him water. This moment became a turning point that changed everything, not just for him, but for the entire company. His response to this humiliation will surprise even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. Stephen sat in the business class seat of his own airplane, gazing out of the window. This wasn't just another flight. Today, his company was showcasing a new model of aircraft for a critical presentation. He was the only black passenger in the cabin, a fact that inevitably drew attention. Despite his countless achievements, Stephen was all too familiar with how easily people judged others based on appearances. Yet he remained confident. Years in the business world and numerous victories had forged his resilience. Caroline, a flight attendant with striking blonde hair and an air of nonchalance, walked down the aisle, assessing the passengers. Her eyes scanned the cabin, pausing briefly on each person, but she paid no particular attention to Stephen. She moved quickly down the row and eventually addressed him. "Do you need anything?" Her voice was flat, devoid of interest. Not wanting to make a fuss, Stephen replied in a measured tone. "May I have some water, please?" Caroline nodded and continued her rounds through the cabin. She stopped at the next passenger, an elderly man in an expensive suit, who wasted no time requesting a cocktail. Caroline smiled, accommodating him promptly. Meanwhile, Stephen waited, but the water never arrived. After some time, Caroline returned, but her indifference persisted. She noticed Stephen sitting silently, yet she neither acknowledged her oversight nor showed any willingness to correct it. Frustration began to simmer within him as he sat, trying to keep his composure. He wasn't one to draw attention to himself, but the sting of being disregarded was undeniable. For several moments, Stephen's thoughts revolved around one persistent theme. How many times have I endured this? The subtle but clear signs of bias, the unspoken judgments from people who felt entitled to decide who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. But Stephen wasn't prepared to let prejudice prevail. Not this time. Raising his hand once more, he spoke calmly but firmly. "I asked for water." Caroline paused, her expression shifting to one of mild confusion, perhaps even irritation. For a fleeting moment, surprise flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by a furrowed brow. Then, with a dismissive tone, she replied, "I'm busy. There are other passengers." The coldness of her words struck him like a blow. Stephen's face hardened, his patience now worn thin. Slowly he stood, his movements deliberate and composed. Without raising his voice, he made his way to the front of the cabin, where the captain was seated. Standing tall, Stephen leaned in slightly and said in a steady tone, "I am the owner of this company. Step into the cabin and address her behavior." The captain froze, clearly caught off guard. For a moment, his expression reflected the gravity of the situation. This was no ordinary passenger. Realizing the stakes, he gave a silent nod of acknowledgement. Unaware of Stephen's true identity, Caroline continued, tending to the other passengers, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just dismissed the very person responsible for the company she worked for. Returning to his seat, Stephen's calm demeanor was replaced by a quiet storm. Internally, anger boiled, but he maintained his composure. His focus shifted away from the immediate slight and toward a larger question. What must I do to ensure respect, not just for myself, but for everyone like me? As he sat back, Stephen knew this wasn't the end. This incident would not be brushed aside or forgotten. He was determined to ensure it never happened again. Not to him, not to anyone. Hours later, Stephen still couldn't shake the humiliation. He tried to focus on work, but the incident replayed in his mind. Caroline continued serving other passengers, smiling warmly at the white ones while avoiding his gaze. Stephen knew she didn't belong in this role. When she approached him again with a tray of drinks, he couldn't stay silent. "You forgot about me," he said, his voice cold. Caroline glanced at him with feigned indifference. "What? Can't you see I've been busy?" Stephen felt his anger rising. As the owner of the airline, being treated like this in his own cabin was unacceptable. "I only asked for water. "That's not much," he said, his tone firm. Caroline scoffed. "Oh, sure, but don't you think you're fine without it?" Stephen froze. Her dismissive tone was the final straw. Rising to his feet, he said evenly, "Step into the cabin. I need to speak with you." Caroline smirked. "Oh, are you the airline owner now? Go ahead, complain to everyone." Stephen, furious but composed, approached the captain near the cockpit. "I need to speak with you immediately," he said. The captain, noting Stephen's intensity, listened closely as Stephen continued. "I am the owner of this company. Make her understand that this behavior is unacceptable. My passengers, regardless of race, will not be humiliated." The captain nodded and went to the cabin, leaving Stephen to return to his seat. His anger began to cool, replaced by determination. This wasn't just about water. It was about ensuring no one felt disrespected in his company again. A few minutes later, the captain returned to the cabin. Striding toward Caroline with a resolute expression, he didn't waste time on pleasantries. Fixing her with a firm gaze, he said, "Your duties are suspended, effective immediately. Leave the cabin." Caroline's mouth opened slightly in disbelief, but no words came out. She stepped back, stunned, then turned and walked toward the exit, her head lowered. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances, unsure of what had just transpired. Stephen, however, watched as the flight attendant left in silence, her defiance gone. But the story didn't end there. The captain turned to Stephen and spoke with calm determination. "I know this doesn't fix everything, but I want you to know, behavior like this has no place in our company. We'll contact you later to address the situation further." Stephen nodded, a mixture of relief and tension washing over him. The moment of anger had passed, but a bitter aftertaste lingered. He realized this incident was a symptom of a deeper issue, one of bias and disrespect that needed to be uprooted. As the captain returned to the other passengers, Stephen sank back into his thoughts. Though he had always strived for professionalism, this experience struck a deeply personal chord. The more he reflected, the more he recognized the invisible barriers he'd faced his entire life. Barriers that had nothing to do with his abilities or accomplishments, but everything to do with how people perceived him. This incident wasn't about a glass of water. It was about ensuring that no one else ever felt diminished in his company. When the plane landed, Stephen made a decision. Action had to be taken immediately. Instead of heading to his office as planned, he called for an urgent meeting with his team. The conversation about equality and respect needed to become a cornerstone of the company's culture, and Stephen was ready to lead that charge. Rather than dismissing this incident as a one-time mistake, he began crafting a plan. Over the following days, every employee at the airline underwent mandatory anti-discrimination training. Respect and equality became core values enshrined in company policy, and Caroline was sent to complete a required program on workplace bias and inclusion. The incident served as a wake-up call for many within the company. They realized that even seemingly small acts of bias could have far-reaching consequences, and all of it had started with one glass of water. Weeks after the incident with Caroline, the story took an unexpected turn. A passenger who had witnessed the event had recorded a video, and it quickly went viral. The media soon caught wind of it, and questions began flooding in about how Stephen's company was addressing racism and discrimination. Stephen found himself at the center of public attention, which further reinforced the significance of what had happened. In a public statement, Stephen explained that the incident had become a pivotal moment for the airline. He announced new initiatives, including mandatory training for all employees to address bias and discrimination. In interviews, Stephen emphasized that his goal was not just to run a successful company, but to create an environment rooted in respect and equality. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. People applauded Stephen's initiatives, and other companies began adopting similar measures, inspired by his leadership. Stephen quickly became an advocate for social justice, using his platform to highlight systemic racism in corporate culture. Caroline, after completing her training, returned to work. One day, she approached Stephen, visibly humbled. "I want to apologize for my behavior," she said, her voice sincere. "I understand now how wrong I was." Her apology marked a significant step, not only for her, but for the entire company. It was a testament to the power of acknowledgement and growth. The incident with Caroline became more than just a personal lesson. It transformed the entire organization. Stephen understood that true change began with awareness, and he was confident that his actions were laying the foundation for a more inclusive and fair workplace for everyone.